Update: I, 28M, can't have children, and my wife, 27F, doesn't want to adopt. The original post is here. When I wrote the previous post, I knew my relationship was over. And it was as if I wanted a stranger on the internet to come up with some brilliant idea that could save my marriage. This Saturday, I talked to my wife, and we decided that it's best for us to break up. I loved her a lot, and I'm sure she loved me too. I think I chose my words poorly in the other post and left out important information. So I'll explain in more detail what led to the separation. I've never been against biological children because we're all biological children of someone. However, I've always been against spending money to have biological children. If we're going to spend money, I believe it's more fair to spend it on adoption since there are thousands of children wanting a home. This isn't a new position of mine, but for some reason, in these 9 years of our relationship, dating plus marriage, my ex-wife and I never discussed this. When I found out I couldn't have children naturally, I told my wife that I wanted to adopt. She then mentioned there were methods for us to still have biological children, mainly in vitro fertilization. So I explained my stance on the matter to her. She even had consultations on her own, tried to convince me, until she came to the conclusion that artificial insemination would be the best option since being biologically related wasn't as important to me, and the costs would be much lower. That's when our discussion on the topic escalated. She saw that I wouldn't budge, so she started saying extremely negative things about children who are up for adoption. She said things like these children are problematic, which is why their biological parents don't want them, that these problems can't be solved with love, care, and psychological support, and that most of these children will end up drug users or simply have no future. I felt personally offended because I myself was a child abandoned by my parents. And when I told her that, she simply said I was an exception. I feel that her saying these things is like a black person being married to a racist. I feel that if she had known from the beginning that I was a child who was abandoned, she wouldn't want to be in a relationship with me. I feel that she would hate me without even knowing me. Furthermore, she has the right to be a biological mother, and I was taking that right away from her, which was also extremely unfair of me. For these reasons, I ended our relationship. Unfortunately, in the previous post, many people also made prejudiced comments about children and the adoption process. The adoption process is not traumatic. It's the process of being abandoned by biological parents, the waiting to be adopted, and many other things that can be traumatic. I understand those who say that children have traumas, but please, give them a chance. They're not to blame for what happened to them. I know not everyone is ready to adopt, but at least don't speak ill of the process or discourage those who want to adopt. I was adopted at an older age than the average, graduated from college, and never caused any trouble for my parents. Of course, I have my personal issues, but I don't think I ever caused any problems for my parents because of them. The happiest day of my life was the day I was adopted. I remember that day every day. Wow. As an adopted person, that was hard to read. Mostly because she voiced the nasty things I've always been afraid people were secretly thinking. It's especially hurtful given your circumstances. I'd like to think she was coming from a place of hurt and was simply lashing out. It may not feel like it in the moment, but you've absolutely made the right decision. And future you will thank you for it. All the best, Op. Wow, thank you for this update. As an adopted child, I agree with everything you've said. I adopted 2 children and they are my world. Your wife sounded cruel and prejudiced. However, you are just as clueless as her. You insisted on ignoring the fact that children who are abused and neglected often have higher needs. and that parents who try to adopt from the foster system or adopt from any kind of system are often broken by the process. I think she only said these things because you insisted on adoption being a rosy picture of saving a child. You seem to completely ignore her concerns about trying to raise children who might not be able to bond or might need intense psychological help because of their trauma. You continually saying that you were abandoned and you turned out fine doesn't mean that all children who have been abused aren't at extreme risk. It is definitely best to divorce since you could not come to any sort of understanding about this. I think it's kinda wild how everyone is skimming over the fact that Op said adoption wasn't traumatic. Yes, being abandoned and the circumstances around how a child ended up in the system typically are traumatic for them. The process of adoption can also be traumatic, and just because Op's experience wasn't doesn't mean he speaks for the majority. He is still continuing to view this entire process with rose-colored glasses. I remember your post, thanks for the update. She said things like these children are problematic, which is why their biological parents don't want them, that these problems can't be solved with love, care, and psychological support, and that most of these children will end up drug users or simply have no future. Yeah, she was saying this out of malice and spite. To hurt you. Super passive-aggressive. I don't know if she necessarily seriously believes that, but on some level she might have believed those kind of things. Even if she didn't, saying stuff like that to be spiteful is pretty horrendous. I can understand why she did it. Because her dream involves the experience of pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding and all that. So in shutting her down on the sperm donor, she may have felt that you were saying she wasn't good enough or wasn't allowed that part of the experience. Internalized body shame. I'm not saying it justifies her behavior. She could have been honest and said she wanted to go through pregnancy specifically instead of going for the jugular and being spiteful. She probably felt that you didn't really care at that point and you were only concerned about your own adoption bandwagon. I'm really glad your adoption process was not traumatic. That's great for you. Not all adopted children will agree. And in most first world countries that are not the US, there is a movement away from allowing foster children to be adopted, in part because of acknowledged trauma. Adoption causes many children. Adoption changes a child's identity irreversibly and often without the child's consent. Adoptees, even those adopted at birth, have significantly higher rates of incarceration, mental health problems and suicide. This isn't to say the children are bad or behave any worse than other children. But anyone adopting or even fostering should be prepared for the potential of dealing with their child's more complex needs. It is really great that your adoption was so successful. However, before you adopt in the future, I would strongly advise you speak to a pre-adoption therapist. I've worked in family law a long time. Been more children's court-appointed counsel than I can count. I've known many children who found adoption or the prospect of adoption, which involves the loss of their identity, to be more traumatic to some utterly horrific abuse. I won't lie. This comes across slightly butthurt from all the well-thought-out comments on your previous post. I personally think if your wife said those things, it was in the heat of the moment after hearing you're unwilling to go down any route where she could become pregnant. Was what she said wrong? Absolutely. Have we not all said stupid things out of pain, hurt? You'd be lying if you say you haven't. I understand how your ex's words hurt you. It's unreasonable to assume all kids waiting for adoption are going to be problematic. But it's equally unreasonable to say you're against paying to have a biological child. It doesn't make sense at all. It looks like you just didn't want your wife to have a biological child just because you can't. Now that you are divorcing, Your ex doesn't need to pay for a biological child anymore. She was going to pay that money to be able to raise a kid with you. I think you just couldn't see that. Still, I think it's the best for both of you. Now you can find a woman willing to adopt with you and she can have a biological kid with another man. It's telling how Op did not care about the genetics about his children until the option of his wife having her biological child came up. I am confused. You described your marriage otherwise great and say that you love your wife. Yet, you'd rather divorce her than, let's say, compromise? You are too stubborn to even accept that maybe you both are right. Allow her to be a biomom while she can and then maybe also adopt a child. Could you not just have both? Or were you stuck on one child only? Or were you stuck on just being right? My sister, who tried to have kids, naturally decided when she was in her mid-30s that it was never going to happen. So, she adopted her daughter, who had been the light of her life. Good luck, Op. You are against spending money on your wife experiencing pregnancy and having her biological child? It didn't need to cost anything though, Op. All it needed was a willing volunteer and a turkey baster? Sorry this happened. But again, study has shown times and time again, adoptees are statistically known to be more at risk for mental health problems, both due to the initial trauma and genetics. You keep looking through it with rose-tinted glasses. It's like you smoked your entire life but did not develop cancer. So the conclusion is smoking isn't a risk and everyone who claims otherwise is a smoking bigot. Nahi, understand that you both have different views on the way to parenting and there is nothing wrong with that at all. I do have a question though. What if you can't adopt? Just playing devil's advocate for a moment, since you both have decided to end your marriage over this. What would you then do, since it is your dream to have a family? Also, yes, adopting can be traumatic for those wanting to. They go through the process. A person is pregnant and cannot take care of their child, so the adopting couple pay all expenses, etc., and then the mother changes her mind. I really wish you both talked of this long before you got together, but that's the past still. If you're not able to adopt, would you stay with your wife and go the IVF route? I'm glad you were able to parse the situation and have the discussion with her. I'm sorry it ended this way. But you were fundamentally incompatible. When people reference adoption trauma, there are a lot of ways that adoptees are impacted and traumatized by the processes surrounding adoption. You mentioned one part, where children are put in foster care or otherwise removed from unsafe environments. And you also mentioned the waiting part. Both of those things are incredibly traumatic. However, there are lots of types of adoptions. International, transracial, foster, closed, open, etc. And those adoptees all experience their own types of traumas, which I assure you are very real. As an adoptee from a closed adoption, I had no narrative or identity other than the one given to me by my adoptive family. They're very loving and kind, and I had a good life. But my adoption impacted me in a lot of negative ways that I didn't recognize until I was an adult. I internalized negative thoughts and I repeated unhealthy behavior patterns that I had to spend a long time in therapy unpacking before I could heal and change. The adoption triad usually focuses on the bio-parents and the adoptive parents' narratives because they are the adults who can verbalize their stories and control their own lives. But the adoptee is thrust into a situation not of their own making. The situation is often painful or complicated, and these children are often expected to just be happy and grateful that they got adopted. Sometimes they are even put in the position of feeling responsible for hurting their grown-ups feelings when they ask uncomfortable questions. Adoptees are also not given the space to process their complex situations and articulate their own feelings safely as they grow and mature and gain more nuanced understandings and thoughts on the issues. So, TLDR, adoption isn't for everyone, and most adoptees do have trauma on some level. It's a much more complex and emotionally difficult process than most people realize or are willing to admit. What she said about adoption was mean, but it totally distracts from you being wrong and petty. First, I do think you are right when you said it was unfair to ask her to give up biological motherhood. You basically wanted her to sacrifice biological motherhood because you couldn't have biological fatherhood. For no good reason. Her proposal was totally fine and you could afford it and move forward together. You just flat out rejected that path? And opted for a path that was objectively worse at meeting the original goal of you both having biological children? I wouldn't be able to forgive that level of selfishness. It would hurt me so much that my partner felt it was appropriate to deny me such a major experience. An experience we were both clear up front we both desired. Just because they weren't the supplier of the sperm, I would question their love and our partnership. I can't find a loving rationale for wanting your partner to suffer just to be equal. She should have broken it off with you instead of lashing out about adoption itself. But either way, it was over when you wouldn't compromise in a reasonable way. Op's ex-wife has a right to having biological children if she so wants. But that does not give her the right to discriminate and disparage orphans. If she was so adamant about having children of her own, that's all she had to say. She only needed to stick to her guns about wanting to experience motherhood in all of its stages. It was completely unnecessary to attack the character of all adoptive children. I'm so sorry, but you made the right choice.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.